Here is a blue ink by Sailor Yonaga.
Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink. The paper I'm using here is a Maruman Mnemosyne Notebook.
As a tone, it gives me a marine or an ultramarine blue kind of feel, yet because it is so dark, I feel, I had to check to see that it wasn't a blue-black, which it isn't. There is some tone variation by pen, but only really matters in extreme nib or flow pens. There is a shading when you look for it, and the swatch shows some red sheen in the center, but it never showed up in the writing. I think we have a good professional blue, but I just don't see this being the blue for me. I think the slight purple and sometimes turquoise lean that this has leaves it sometimes just out of the realm of the blue I would be looking for. It's still good, it's just certainly not me.
The pen for today is a Pilot Metropolitan. All of the writing samples are done with a Platinum 3776 with a soft fine nib which writes rather dry, a Hero 7035 with a fine nib that writes wet, a Visconti Van Gogh with a medium nib and an average flow, a Lamy Safari with a broad nib that writes average. Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there, starting with the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
Looking at the soft fine nib, this is the lightest tone that we're going to get. Now, we get no feathering and we get no spread. That slight turquoise lean that I was talking about, you see here more than anywhere else, really, and you see it in Don't, because I don't care for that particular part on the second line. It starts lighter and gets darker as it goes, shading into the T, but we see some of that turquoise on the DUN, and I tell you that it does shade. Look at tell you that on the third line, where tell is quite dark, but the first L is a little bit lighter than the rest of the word. U on the top part of the Y is lighter, starts to darken up through the Y, gets very dark at the OU, where that is a very dark tone the whole way. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is quite a bit darker than it was with the soft fine. There is no feathering, there is no spread, and if you've been following this channel, you know that I like shading. Does this shade? No. Look at following on the second line. Completely a dark tone. It's very dark with that bit of a purple lean in this blue. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the wet fine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we get very little shading unless you are looking for it. Look at unless on the first line. The LE and the end of the last S are a little bit darker with that purple lean in this word. The rest of it is a very dark blue. And since we're talking about it, look at since on the second line. Mostly a dark blue, but the I really gets darker with that purple lean. Same with the E. Looking at the broad nib, it is just a tad bit lighter in general than it was with the medium or the wet fine nib. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we get shading, and you do not have to look far to find it. Look at not far on the second line. Not starts lighter, works its way darker to that kind of purple tone at the T, where far starts as a very dark blue and on the R becomes very, very dark again. Somebody is really going to love this. Look at somebody on the third line. The S is very dark dark. The O-M-E, lighten up a bit. The B, very dark. The O and beginning of the D, lighter as the blue. The end of the D and the Y, very dark and purple leaning. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Like most inks, this one comes in a bottle.
This is how the Pilot Custom 823 fits. And here is the Pelican M1000. Here's the ink level when you can no longer fill a Lamy Safari. There is approximately 7 milliliters of ink left.
The next writing sample is done in a Portage reporter's notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is just a little bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we do get some shading, and you can easily call it. Look at call it on the second line. The C, the bottom of the L's, and the S are darker than the A or the top of the L's. On it, starts lighter, gets very dark at that T. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is a whole lot darker than it was with the soft fine. We get no feathering, we get no spread. As far as shading, you're going to be waiting, holding your breath for quite a while to get it here. Look at waiting on the second line. No shading whatsoever. It, like all the rest of the writing, just trying to point at a word, all one uniform tone. I think the tone we're getting here with this paper is very nice. I think it looks good. I think the performance is great. It's just not shading. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the wet fine, the same tone as the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread. We get some shading if you must find it. Now, find and must, but in between there was a fact that was wrong. Fact starts darker, lightens up at the AC, a very dark at the T, where find is in itself an entirely dark word. Must on the third line starts lighter, works its way much darker at the end of the S into the T. Looking at the broad nib, it is a little bit lighter than it was with the medium, a little bit lighter than on the Clairfontaine. We're not getting any feathering, we're not getting any spread, and well, we are getting some shading. Look at well, the very first word on the first line. It starts lighter and works its way darker, shading gradually all the way through it. I would have really thought, or you might think, that a lot of this would have been one tone, like think on the second line, except think isn't all one tone. The IN in the middle is just a little bit lighter than the outsides of the word. Looking at the back of the page, you see that we get no major bleeding. I think you could write back here and nothing bled through touching the page underneath.
There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting it into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. Not showing the turquoise that the Clairfontaine showed. Really shows as a blue to very dark blue in what's going on. We get no feathering, we get no spread. You don't have to beg for shading here. Look at begged on the second line. It starts darker at the BE, lightens up at the G's, darker at the E, but then lightens at the beginning of the D, very dark during the downstroke of the D, offering up shading without a problem, like on offered on the third line, which starts lighter, gets darker at the fur right in the middle, and lightens up a little bit. But again, we're talking about a dark blue to a dark blue purple. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is a whole lot darker than it was on the soft fine, a whole lot darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering. We get no spread. The tone we're getting here is really very, very dark purple. It doesn't make me think blue at all. It makes me think super dark purple, almost like a purple black. Shading, we shall see on the second line. There is no shading, and I just chose those 3 words to show how there is nothing here. Those 3 are like all the other words that are around. One tone, no shading. Looking at the medium nib, it is just a tad bit lighter than it was with the wet fine nib, a little bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. No feathering, no spreading. As far as shading, stop pleading for it. Stop pleading on the third line shows you're not getting any. Once again, when you look at that and compare to anything else on this page, there's nothing showing any kind of shading with this paper. Looking at the broad nib, it is just a little bit lighter than it was with the medium, darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread. We do get bathed at moments with some shading in the river of goodness. Look at bathed on the first line. The bottom of the B and the A are lighter than the rest of the word, which is very dark. And in the river on the first line, the I, E, R are darker than the R or V. It's not something that's great and huge in its shading, but it does show that it can do it. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left. Pen flush is on the top right. 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread. It is refreshing to see some shading coming back. Look at refreshed on the second line. Now, the REF is just a little bit lighter than the SE, and the HE is a little bit darker because the beginning of the D lightens up a bit and the downstroke of the D much darker. So there is a little bit of shading that we can see here, like a little directly underneath that starts lighter, gets darker at the T's, light at the top of the L, very dark at the E. Now the shading isn't doing as well as it did on the Clairfontaine, but it is definitely present. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is a whole lot darker than it was with the soft fine, the same tone as the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread. If you want some shading, well, march to the back of the line because it is not going to be here. Looking at march on the second line, we see that we get really one tone in that word all the way through, like through right next to it. One tone, no shading, solid, very dark purple leaning blue. Looking at the medium nib, it is just a tad bit lighter than it was with the wet fine, a little bit lighter than on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we get shading called Carrick. Looking at called Carrick on the second line, the CA is very dark, but the first L is much lighter. Lead at the end of that led its way to being much darker. And Carrick, the C is a dark blue, while the A is that dark blue purple. The R's A, C lighten up, but that K becomes very dark again at the end. Looking at the broad nib, it is just a little bit lighter than it was with the medium. About the same tone as the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering and we get no spread. As far as shading happens, again, we get the Carrick of it. Looking at the Carrick on the first line, where the starts lighter. The top of the H and the E are incredibly dark and really show some purple tones. In Carrick, it's the top of the C and the A that are super dark, but the bottom of the C is a very dark blue. It lightens up through rock until you get to the K that becomes very, very dark at the end. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Califolio Ocanto. Here is Diamine Aqua Blue. Here is KWZ Azure number 4.
Here is Private Reserve American Blue Fast Dry.
The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Looking at the soft, fine nib, we get no feathering, we get no spread. We get something that is a little bit darker than we had on the Clairfontaine. Now, we are still getting some shading, like in Carrick, again, on the first line. The CA are very dark, and the rock lightens up until you get to the K. That gets much darker, bringing us home to our roots of shading. Look at home almost directly underneath that, where the H starts darker, the gets a little bit lighter, and the E very dark again. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is a whole lot darker than it was with the soft fine, a little bit darker than on the Clairfontaine. No feathering, no spread. It's not even introducing shading. Look at introduce on the second line. Totally one tone the whole way through. Now, for student note-taking, I think a lack of shading at times can be an advantage. And in this case, I think it looks fairly nice in this very dark blue-purple tone that we're getting. Looking at the medium nib, we get the same tone as the wet fine. We get no feathering. We get no spread. Shading will happen here. Look at will happen on the second line. The I and first L are a little bit darker than the W and last L, and happen starts very dark at the H, lightens up at the A. The top of the P is very dark, but the bottom of the P is light, and it stays lighter through the rest of the word. Looking at the broad nib, it is lighter than it was with the medium, lighter than on the Clairfontaine. Really, here we're starting to see some of those turquoise tones come through again, as well as some of the darker, dark blue purple tone. No feather, no spread. Yes, it is still giving shading again. Look at still, very first word on the first line. We get that the lighter version of the blue with a little bit of that turquoise lean. The first L is very dark and purple leaning, but the second L, which is interesting because the top is a little bit lighter, the bottom is much, much darker. And I'm going to have to take back my no feathering thing here because that second L definitely has some shading going on. Not that it's something that dwarfs everything else that happens. When we look at dwarves on the second line, we see that the D is a little bit darker as a tone. We get a nice lighter tone through most of the word, and the S gets very dark at the end. So I think the shading we're getting here is above what we've gotten in a lot of other areas. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
While it's nice to see inks in the same color family, I prefer to find an ink that complements this color on the page. Here is a pink ink by Sailor Pesh. Here is an orange ink by Califolio Aurora. Here is a magenta ink by Private Reserve Plum. Here is a yellow ink by Pen BBS number 184. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Looking at the soft, fine nib, it is darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. We do get some feathering and we do get some spread. Neither the feathering or the spread are anything to really be an issue here. I think what we're mostly seeing is tiny feathers that happen like on the first line, where the H and the T, where it gets darker, you get a little bit of feathering, and it's easier to see in person, like person on the first line, where the P and the R, N, all show tiny bits of shading, of feathers, just tiny though. Now, when we're talking about shading, the shading does happen like taking in the second line. The K is a little bit lighter than all of the word around it. Back up to that just above it, where the T is a little bit lighter than the H. The A lightens up, and the last T is just a tad bit darker. So we are getting some shading even here on 20-pound copy paper. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is a whole lot darker than it was with the soft fine, a little bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get feathering, we get spread, we get no shading. We've definitely seen things that do better. Look at better on the first line. It's almost like it would be blurry, except that's feathering going on. All of it, like look at it all, still on the first line. A lot of feathering in all of this, and the spread is taking it about up to a broad, maybe a little bit, or sorry, about up to a medium, maybe just a little bit farther. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the wet fine nib. We still get feathering and we still get spread. I think here the feathering is smaller than we saw on the wet fine nib. It's not something you have to be super careful about. Looking at careful to see where some of the feathering is occurring. You see it a little in the R and on the last LY. It's definitely there. Not a huge deal. Same with the spread. Definitely there. Taking it a little bit under a broad. So it's not huge amounts of spread. As far as shading, you always have to be careful about shading. Look at careful on the first line, where the F and the LE are a bit darker than the rest of the word. Same with wizard underneath on the second line, where the D is quite darker. And you have to be a little bit careful because sometimes on the copy paper, it bleeds when it shades. Looking at the broad nib, it is a little bit lighter than we had with the medium, darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. We do get feathering, we do get spread. It makes these letters look a little bit furrier than they need to, like furrier on the second line. That has really consistent feathering all over it. Consistent in feathering. Now, shading, yeah, it does give some shading. When you look at what on the first line, even though I started to screw up there, you see that the AH, not the AT at the end, the AH, because I misspelled what, that's a bit darker than the rest of the word. It stands out. Looking at that directly underneath it, the H and the last T are darker than the first T and the A. So it can shade, but with shading comes a lot of feathering. Looking at the back of the page, the really good news is I'm not showing you the page underneath because nothing bled through touching that page. When you see this, there is no writing on the back of the page because of how deep the ink gets into the paper. Although you do stand some chance if you really wanted to with the soft fine, being it's a dry writer, I wouldn't do it because I feel like I would lose important things.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink? The paper I'm using here is yellow Rhodia paper.
The dry soft fine shows some of both the turquoise and purple with this blue, and because of the shading. The wet fine and the medium flow medium both look about the same, with it being a darker blue that does shade into the purple lean. The broad has the same tones as the medium, but shows much more of those darker blues, where the medium showed more of the purple lean. While this isn't for me as a color, I like the color best from a wet fine or a medium flow medium nib with the darker blue shading into purple.
I hope you got something out of this video, and thanks for watching.